Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel and who is apparently on a 3-month vacation here, right, Richard?
No. The academic, the friend of freedom, is never at rest.
Richard, if you're an academic, if you're a professor, you're always at rest and you're always on vacation, even during the school year.
Do you see what I have to put up with? And this is practically every week.
If you're not familiar with the Future of Freedom Foundation or you're just getting acquainted, we invite you to visit our website at fff.org. You'll notice that we're having an absolutely fantastic conference on June 3rd. I would invite everyone to attend. It's possibly the best lineup we've ever had in a conference, including Academy Award-winning producer-director Oliver Stone. It's a one-day conference. It's very inexpensive, $99, and I think you'll find it was well worth your money. It's one of the most fascinating. It will be one of the most fascinating, thought-provoking, profound conferences you will ever attend. June 3rd, one-day conference. Richard, last week we talked about one of the libertarian giants, and that's Ludwig von Mises. I thought we would continue that conversation on libertarian giants and discuss today two of the giants that have played a major role in the development of libertarian thought and have had a big influence on people such as you and me and many other libertarians, and that's Frederic Bastiat and Henry Hazlitt. Both of these individuals played a huge role for me when I was discovering libertarianism. They're somewhat related, as we'll talk about, where Hazlitt draws on ideas of Bastiat. They lived at completely different times, Hazlitt in the 20th century and Bastiat in the 19th century. But Bastiat, I remember when I first discovered libertarianism when I was in my late 20s, Bastiat was just had a profound impact on me. He wrote books that, about 4 books. One, his most famous, I think, is a little monograph called The Law, where he talks about the legitimate role of government in society. And then his other books, selected essays on political economy, economic harmonisms, economic sophisms. I mean, they're just absolutely fantastic. If anyone wants to learn why libertarians are so committed to principles of free trade and the market economy, all you got to do is read Bastiat. In fact, Richard, I hold that if anybody reads Bastiat's 4 books and Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson, especially students, that person will know more economics than about 98% of the economics professors in this country. So why don't you give us a little rundown of Frederic Bastiat, who he was, and why he played an important role in the development of libertarian thought?
Well, as you were suggesting, I, as well as you and multitudes of other people, have found that Frederic Bastiat, a French classical liberal economist who lived in the first half of the 19th century, was one of the most eloquent, concise, clear, persuasive writers for all forms of freedom, but particularly economic liberty, of the last 200 years. There is no doubt. So let me sort of give a little thumbnail about him and why his ideas came to be important. He was born in 1801. He died tragically from tuberculosis when in 1850. He was a relatively young man, obviously. His parents died when he was relatively young. He grew up on the farm of a relative in southern France. He inherited the farm when this relative passed away, but he wasn't interested in farming. I mean, that was just his way of earning a living. But what he became passionate about was this rising ideas of personal and social and economic liberty, now what we call the classical liberal tradition in those early decades of the 19th century that were beginning to grow in importance and significance. He particularly was enamored with the liberal writers of Great Britain, and especially on the issue of free trade versus protectionism. the writings of the Anti-Corn Law League, especially their founders and organizers, John Bright and Richard Cobden. He started corresponding with them, and besides a letter friendship, he eventually came to England and met Richard Cobden, and they became personal friends. Now, he came to develop his own way of persuading about freedom ideas, excuse me, because he had a farm neighbor who lived several miles away. And back then, remember, we're talking about the early decades of the 19th century. If you wanted to get around, you either walked, you rode a horse, or you had a horse drive a wagon to get you around. So even a few miles, you're not going to see your neighbors very often. So as a consequence, they started corresponding, and about what? Well, it turns out, as I understand the history of it, that his neighbor was basically very sympathetic to socialist ideas. And Bastiat now was already a full-blown free market, classical liberal advocate. And they started writing letters about this. And eventually, over time, Bastiat persuaded his neighbor friend to give up these socialist beliefs and values to a classical liberal individualism. That was sort of his apprenticeship. And then for about the last 10 or 15 years of his life, recall I just said he died when he was only about 50, it was like a tidal wave of writings that he started doing, all of which are in the books that you mentioned, Jacob. His economic sophisms, selected essays on political economy, the law, and then when he, excuse me, when he thought was going to be his literary magnum opus, it's called Economic Harmonies. It's a treatise on economics, which he just barely completed before his death. So as a consequence of this, he had developed this style, particularly in these short, punchy essays, to explain the logic of free trade against protectionism, capitalism versus socialism, individualism versus collectivism, the difference between a free society based upon voluntary cooperation versus one based upon compulsion and force. And what is brilliant in these essays, with clarity, conciseness, vivid imagery, humor, and sarcasm, it shows the absurdity in the ideas of his policy opponents, the protectionists, the interventionists, the socialists. But as many commentators have pointed out, that while he often used sarcasm, he never made fun of the individual whose views he was criticizing or challenging. He pointed out the absurdities in the ideas, never questioning the motives or intentions of the writer of those ideas. And that way he could win people over. Now, these essays were, excuse me, extremely successful. It resulted in him moving to Paris. He tried to set up a publication, which in English would just be called Free Trade. It did not succeed very well. He even served briefly as a deputy in the French Parliament in Paris. But because of his, excuse me, but because of the emerging tuberculosis problem, he had to resign. And in fact, he died in Italy. He'd gone further south for attempting to have climate cure for the tuberculosis. But tragically, he passed away. Now, he attempted to apply these ideas to the real world of politics because he had seen the success of his colleagues and his friends in Great Britain. The free trade movement there had overthrown mercantilism, the 18th century system of government regulation and control. Free trade was basically established unilaterally in Britain in the 1840s. This acted as a great stimulus and guide for him. But all of his activities in France turned out to be unsuccessful. He could not shift or change or move the collectivist and interventionist trends in his home country. So at one level, one would think that when he passed away, he would have to be viewed as a failure. He began as an articulator of ideas, hoping to reform in a better direction in society, and the society kept moving in the same bad direction even after he died. But what can say was that, in fact, there's probably been no writer on our side of the fence focusing on the arguments and the level of presentation as Frederic Bastiat, who has been more successful and more deserving of recognition of heroic endeavor than Frederic Bastiat. Because since his death, in 1850, and now what? It's over 150 years later, 160, almost 170 years later. The fact is that his books have been kept in print virtually all of this time. Certainly in the English-speaking world, translated into many languages. It has appeared as a collected body of works in his home country of France. And for generations, he has succeeded through the written word in winning people over to economic liberty more than anyone else. But as you began, Jake, in briefly mentioning some of his contributions, his core value as a thinker is that each individual has a right, a natural right, to his life, liberty, and honestly acquired property. This is the foundational basis upon which he challenges the collectivists. An individual has a right to the honest earned fruits of his labor, and relationships that are respectful equivalently of others must be based, therefore, on courtesy and mutual agreement. And then following again in the footsteps of those like Adam Smith, he argues that by giving men freedom to follow their own interests, but in that arena of voluntary exchange, each one applies his own knowledge, wisdom, and abilities to advance himself by improving the circumstances of others. Now, this is the revolutionary idea that with brilliance, eloquence, conciseness, Bastiat gave to the world, in fact, continues to be read today. And if I could just Liberty Fund, a nonprofit educational organization located in Indianapolis, Indiana, well known for keeping classics of freedom in print and in handsome editions, has been now reprinting all of Bastiat's works, and in many cases new translations, and some of his works that have never been in English reprinted. That itself shows the continuing relevance, interest, importance, and value of Bastiat's contributions to the cause of liberty.
Yeah, your point about his relationship with Richard Cobden and John Bright is a very good one, and it certainly is important for us libertarians today. I mean, the irony is that, and you and I have talked about Cobden and Bright and the Anti-Corn Law League in England and how successful they were in pamphleteering and speeches and bringing England around to the principles of free trade at around the same time, the mid-1800s or so, a little earlier. But here's Bastiat in France doing essentially the same thing and meeting with utter failure. Yet today, while libertarians praise Cobden and Bright, certainly they don't look to Cobden and Bright as any form of intellectual inspiration at all, it seems to me. I mean, to a very limited extent. It's Bastiat, the failure in France, that serves as a much bigger inspiration for libertarians. And I think that's because of the principled way that he set forth his arguments. I mean, he certainly was not a reformer. He talked in terms of principles. And that certainly served as my inspiration when I started the Future of Freedom Foundation. And you were there at the very beginning, writing essays for our monthly journal that at that time was called Freedom Daily. And I remember you and I talking several times about the importance of making our essays timeless in nature, so that they would apply regardless of this particular time and circumstances. And I think that's why Bastiat serves as such an inspiration for me, not only because his writings are absolutely brilliant, as you point out, but because he was willing to stick with his principles, even in the face of failure and adversity. Another interesting aspect of this that you focus in on was that he was addressing the collectivists of his time, or socialism. I mean, it goes to show you that this debate between libertarians, the advocates of unhampered markets, of free markets, and socialists, it's not anything new. It's been going on for centuries. And it certainly was an active debate during Bastiat's time. The advocates of socialism, of government control over the means of production or ownership or regulation, and there was Bastiat making the principal argument against these people. One of the my favorite essays written by Bastiat, to give you kind of an example of why he was so effective, was he had an essay called The Petition of the Candlestick Makers to the Government. And he was showing the fallacies of of government protectionism from overseas competition and the virtues of free trade. And so he had this essay where the candlestick makers are petitioning the French government to require all buildings in the country to shutter up their windows because they're faced with unfair competition by a foreigner. And the foreigner is the sun. The sun doesn't have any costs, and it's just not fair that the candlestick makers should have to compete against the sun. So if you require everybody to board up their windows, now the candlestick makers, their role becomes more important. It produces jobs for the candlestick industry that can be attracting people to work in the candlestick industry. The whole country can be prosperous by protecting the country from the unfair competition of the sun. And I thought that was absolutely a brilliant exposition, Richard.
Absolutely. He would show these ridiculous elements in many ways. One of the others, in one of his essays, he talks about how, now he's talking about the early decades of the 19th century. So this is the birth of modern industrial technology and its application. So he's talking about how to save people time and effort and more conveniently trade with each other. The technologies of the time are now allowing the building of tunnels through mountains that can be reinforced with concrete and so on. So now the train can go through the mountain instead of over or under or around, or sometimes not at all. So the people of two societies can interact, associate, trade with each other. What brilliant opportunities the technology of our time permits. The train through the mountain connecting two people previously isolated from each other. And what do the two respective governments put at the openings of the tunnel at both ends? Customs tolls. So here we have a tunnel to try to make the ease of people to interact and associate and benefit from what they could trade with each other. And what do they got to do? Put up customs tolls to charge them and do away with all, if not at least some of the advantages of the technology of being able to tunnel through a mountain.
Well, that wasn't the only thing you said about railroads. I remember when he wrote about the negative railroad, where the railroad company starts to build a railroad, and a town says, well, there should be a stop mandated here, and think of the jobs that will be produced by making the railroad stop there, that people can cater to the passengers and so forth. So the next town says, well, yeah, well, then they should do it for us too. And so you end up with a railroad with all these stops, to the point that you end up with a negative railroad because it's filled with stops.
Yeah, and then one other is perhaps, besides the law, one of his most other famous essays is what is seen and what is not seen. And this debunks the idea that government can create wealth and opportunity and jobs out of thin air and at no cost. Because he says, let us suppose the government decides to build a bridge, or to re-roof a schoolhouse, or to put people to work building a road. What is the immediate reaction of this? Well, we see people at work. We see the bridge being repaired, the road constructed, the school roof being redone. And we say, look at the jobs and the opportunities. And what Bastiat says, that is what is seen. Yes, it's clear. But what is unseen is that where does the money come from to fund these government public works? And the answer is the government has no money to spend to employ people other than what it taxes from other members of the society. And what is unseen are all the employment opportunities, the investments, the protections that would have gone on, admittedly in different directions, if the government had not taxed people's wealth and instead left it in people's pockets. He begins the essay by talking about the young street urchin who holds a brick through the baker's glass window. And at first, everybody comes and stands there and commiserates with him. Oh, yes, you know, the youth have no respect for property nowadays. And then someone decides to wax eloquent, philosophic, and says, yes, the tragedy of the baker is the benefit and the opportunity of the glazier, because the glazier will have a job. He'll have to be employed to replace the broken storefront window, and he'll hire a few people to help him and to build it and then install it on the retail storefront. But what Bastiat says is that, yes, that's what is seen. but what is unseen? Let's suppose that the young street urchin had not thrown the brick through the glass window. The glass window had remained intact. The money that the baker might have spent to replace that broken window would have enabled him to do what? Invest and buy a second oven, so that he would have been able to expand the amount of loaves of bread he could manufacture each day to meet the food needs of the members of the community. Or he might have bought his wife a new winter coat or new shoes for his own children. Would that not have generated employment in the textile industry, in the shoe manufacturing industry, in the oven manufacturing industry? But the difference is that we would have had the unbroken storefront window and all of these things to add to our wealth. Instead, by breaking the window, we've had to waste resources that could have been productively used to increase our wealth and betterment to merely replace that which had previously existed. We're running in place. We're delaying and stagnating growth. And if I can just continue with the application of that to our own times. After 9/11, everyone said, what a tragedy, what a terrible thing, what monsters who would hijack and fly these commercial airlines into the two twin towers in lower Manhattan in New York City, the destruction, the death, the havoc, the personal psychological trauma. But after the initial, clamor and excitement and anger about this, in the pages of the New York Times, on their opinion page, there appeared an article, I forget who wrote it. I'm tempted to say Krugman, but I don't want to assign that to him because it may not be true. But someone on their opinion page said, but wait a second. Think of all the jobs that are going to be created in rebuilding whatever new tower is put up to replace the Twin Towers. And think of all the surrounding buildings that will have to be repaired or even have to be torn down and built from anew because of the destruction, the jobs, the employment, the profit opportunities. Is that not what is seen and what is unseen? If those terrorists had not hijacked the planes and the towers had not been destroyed, besides the 3,000 lives who were lost that would not have been and have gone on with their own lives, the wealth, the resources, the capital equipment, the labor services that went in to just repair all the destruction could have been used to do many things that had to be delayed, put off, and perhaps not done at all, because scarce resources, including labor, had to be utilized to merely replace what we had. We're worse off. We're not better off.
Yeah, well, that's a nice segue then to Henry Hazlitt, because Henry Hazlitt has an excellent part of his excellent book, Economics from One Lesson, on what is seen and unseen. So why don't you give us a little synopsis of Henry Hazlitt's background?
Yes, Henry Hazlitt was born in the late 19th century. He lived until, I'm blanking out. Maybe you remember, Jacob. I believe the mid or late 1980s. I know he lived into his mid-90s. He came from a relatively poor family. He had started college, had to drop out to support his family because his father passed away. And he went into journalism. He worked for several New York newspapers, and that developed his skills of learning how to write things clearly and concisely and within a limited word time space, because of the editor would say 3,000 words, 1,500 words, 700 words. He ended up in the 1930s. Well, actually, let me step back. In the beginning of the 1930s, I think it was around 1930 or 31, he became the book review editor of The Nation magazine. Now, The Nation magazine then and has continued to now to be a relatively, if not extremely, left-wing, quote, progressive publication. It really didn't start out that way, but that would be a different story. Now, as the book review editor, he was supposed to review books. And he started first reviewing books about the Great Depression. That is, proposing this explanation and explaining this cure for the Great Depression. And he'd already been reading free market writers in the early part of his journalism career. He had read Adam Smith. He had read the classical economists. He had read a very famous British economist of the late 19th, early 20th century named Philip Wicksteed, who had written a brilliant treatise called The Common Sense of Political Economy. He had read a number of others, so he was well immersed in the traditional market-oriented classical tradition of economics, and he began to challenge in his book reviews these advocates of collectivism, interventionism, and so on. And what happened then is that other writers for the nation would then write pieces challenging his book reviews as regular article rebuttals. And then, of course, since they were challenging him, he got a chance to write a rebuttal of their reply. So he got started in the pages of the Nation magazine, talking about government public works, deficit spending, and so on. But then in 1933, he was offered another opportunity, which resulted in him leaving the Nation. There was a very famous social critic, satirist of the first half of the 20th century named H.L. Mencken. Maybe some of the listeners or viewers have at least heard his name. He's a brilliant satirist and literary critic with great humor and with strong individualist classical liberal instincts in which he would ridicule the absurdities of unrestrained democracy, collectivism, and the bunk of politics. H.L. Mencken was the editor of the American Mercury magazine, and he wanted to step down for that. And he asked Henry Hazlitt to become the editor of the American Mercury, a position that Hazlitt held for, I believe, 3 years, till about 1936. And in now we're into the New Deal. So he started writing pieces in the American Mercury challenging the New Deal programs, the National Recovery Administration, the growth of concentrated power, the undermining of the Constitution. And he was bringing in other writers to work for the American Mercury. Now, at this time, around 1936 or so, he had an even greater economic opportunity, and that was he was asked to be an economic editor of the New York Times. So for about 10 years, he would write the unsigned editorials on the editorial page of the New York Times on economic issues. So he was in the second half of the 1930s into the war years, he would challenge and criticize the big government overspending activity of the Franklin Roosevelt administration. But with the coming of the end of the war, the New York Times was moving towards beliefs, we need to have Keynesian policies, we need to have an activist role of government, we have to support international organizations like the recently founding International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the New York Times basically wanted to let him go. But then he developed another great opportunity, and that is from 1946, September 1946, until I believe mid-1966, that is for 20 years, he wrote a weekly column called Business Tides for Newsweek magazine. Now, Newsweek is sort of gone today, but back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, if you wanted to follow what was going on with politics and everything else, both at home and abroad, you would read the news magazines, Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News World Report. Now, the Newsweek was not quite as conservative pro-market as U.S. News World Report, which was very conservative, but it was extremely free market because of Hazlitt's weekly column and a senior editor named Raymond Moley who had a full-page editorial on the back of each issue of Newsweek magazine during those years. And with this platform, Hazlitt was able to write about virtually every economic issue of the day for a 20-year period, challenging the trends during the Truman administration, then the Eisenhower years, during the Kennedy years, into the LBJ Great Society years, all of these trends, which had profound influence. Now, what he also did is that he would also take these columns and spread them into chapters of books. Now, in one instance, his famous book, which you mentioned, Economics in One Lesson, was published in 1946, just about the time he was leaving the New York Times. But he had been using a lot of the ideas he had written in New York Times editorials, plus having free time to write things, to write this book. And what he attempts to do is he tries to take Bastiat's ideas and update them to the modern issues of the day. So using the Bastiat method of what is seen and what is unseen, and fundamental principles of market thinking, he challenges public works, deficit spending, the fear that demobilization at the end of the Second World War will result in great unemployment, which it didn't. The idea that if you want to stimulate the economy, it's not through government spending, but through leaving money in people's pockets for work, savings, and investments in the private sector. This book, Economics One Lesson, has to be said to challenge or rival even the international outreach and success of Bastiat's own work. Because Economics One Lesson has been translated into at least 24 languages over the decades since it appeared, and influenced an immense amount of people. He would also take these essays and build them into books. He wrote a book called Everything You Wanted to Know About Inflation, a book called Man versus the Welfare State, The Conquest of Poverty. I could go on and on. I should just mention one other thing, if I may. He wrote a novel, and this novel came out in the early 1950s, and it's called Time Will Run Back. And what it is, it's the story about a futuristic society with a Stalin-like dictator. And the Stalin-like dictator dies. And of course, who becomes the new dictator? His son. But the son is a little bit concerned and has had doubts about his father. And the son's close friend is this other fellow who then explains to him how he can make that totalitarian society better by moving away from state control to free markets. And so there's these dialogues in the novel in which the friend is teaching the young dictator that the government can't know everything. The government can't regulate and plan everything. The free market can solve all these problems. And so by the end of the novel, he's won over the young dictator to follow a policy of laissez-faire and end tyranny. And that went through several editions. And I should just also mention about this is that he used one other mode of communication that was the technology of the time, and that was radio. In the mid and late 1940s, he would appear on radio talk shows. Now, think of the Sunday morning news shows on the networks, on CNN or Fox, right? The talking heads. Well, he was doing that on radio. Now, of course, in 1946 and 47, 45, 46, and 47, this was when everyone said, well, the war's ending, but we need to keep planning in place. We need to have deficit spending to guarantee full employment because the boys will be coming home. How will they have work? And he would appear on these radio talk shows that had a wide audience throughout the United States, debunking these interventionists and socialists. So Hazlitt's influence in the 20th century through these various mediums of newspapers, magazines, even radio. He also wrote widely for the Freeman, regularly for the Freeman, published by the Foundation for Economic Education. Through these avenues, Hazlitt has to be considered one of the great giants. And I'll just mention one other sort of concluding thing about this. When he stepped down from writing his weekly editorials in Newsweek magazine in 1966, he was replaced by Milton Friedman, representing a free market view, Paul Samuelson, the famous Keynesian who, like Friedman, went on to win a Nobel Prize, and another sort of middle-of-the-road economist named Henry Wallach. And when Friedman took over this position as one of the replacement econ editors for the Newsweek magazine, he wrote a letter to Henry Hazlitt saying that it took 3 of us to replace him.
Yeah, it really is amazing the success that he achieved as a libertarian within the mainstream, and didn't compromise his ideas. Was out there in the mainstream at Newsweek, New York Times, expounding the kind of ideas that you and I expound today that the mainstream finds radical. I mean, it really goes to show you the different temperament of the times. The other thing that worth mentioning is that the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, we had the rise of Keynesianism. Yes. And it was Hazlitt that was leading the intellectual charge against Keynesian economics. In fact, I think the title of one of his books is The Critics of Keynesian Economics.
Yeah, he has 2 volumes, one of which he wrote and the other he edited. And thanks for reminding me, Jacob, because that should be mentioned for the viewers. Keynesianism, this idea that government monetary and fiscal policy should be actively micromanaging the macro economy, dominated the economics profession in the post-World War II period. Very few criticisms came out challenging the Keynesian approach. But in 1959, Henry Hazlitt published a book called The Failure of the New Economics. And this is literally, I mean this literally, a chapter by chapter summary and critique of Keynes's famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which came out in February 1936 and was the basis of the Keynesian revolution, and shows the fundamental fallacies in the logic, the premises, the factual basis, from one end of the book to the other. He then followed up with that, which is, I think, what you were referring to. In 1960, he brought together a fact anthology called The Critics of Keynesian Economics, which he wrote an introduction. All those who, up until that time, had been critics of Keynesianism in serious articles, but clearly written, so anybody can sort of read and follow the arguments, from 1936 until the time of that had been sort of lost, ignored by the mainstream of the profession, and certainly by the pundits in the newspapers. So besides anything else, he established, if you will, besides his popular writings, his scholarly reputation, at least in the eyes of market-oriented economists, with this rigorous, though clearly written and easy to follow, chapter by chapter criticism called The Failure of the New Economics.
Yeah, I know we've gone over time, but I think it's also worth mentioning one little anecdote in Hazlitt's life. Last week we talked about Ludwig von Mises, and as many of our viewers know, Mises had to escape from Europe when the Nazis took over. He was Jewish. He was ardently anti-collectivist, anti-totalitarianism, and was certainly on Hitler's list of people that needed to be rounded up and sent to a concentration camp. So he barely escapes Europe to come to the United States. And tell us what Hazlitt's reaction to that was.
Oh yes. So Hazlitt had discovered Mises. Well, he was a journalist in the 1930s. In fact, he wrote a review of the English translation of Mises's famous book Socialism in the New York Times. And he also reviewed, I think in 1934, maybe Theory of Money and Credit, but I know for sure he reviewed Socialism. And he considered this like one of the great treatises on the philosophy of liberty, in the context of which Mises tears all aspects of socialism to threads. And he considered this like a book in the tradition of the great liberals of the 19th century. So as Hazlitt told the story, he was sitting at his Newsweek desk, and suddenly the phone rings, and he picks up and says hello, and the voice from the other end, in a relatively deep baritone, heavily German accent, says, "This is Ludwig von Mises." And Hazlitt said, this was like as if over the phone line, the voice said, "This is John Stuart Mill," like a voice of a giant from the past. But Mises had known that Hazlitt had reviewed his book. He appreciated it. He knew that he was working at the New York Times, and that he had called the New York Times, and they became fast friends. And according to Mises's widow, Margaret Mises, in the 1940s and into the 50s, it would be not uncommon for Mises and Hazlitt to be on the phone talking to each other about these various policy and economic issues 2 or 3 times a day. And they would share with each other their writings to get their opinions from the other before it was published.
All right. On that note, I know we've run out of time. We got to wrap things up. Enjoyed the show, Richard. For those of you that don't know much about FFF, come and visit us at fff.org. Take note of our big conference on June 3rd here in Northern Virginia, the National Security State in JFK. Richard, until next week.
Till next week. Thank you.